So welcome to the final presentations of the 2021 Summer Research Program. And I want to give everybody who has done research a big round of applause. Amazing projects. Please bear with us with the technology this year because we're going to be bouncing back and forth between people who are presenting on Zoom, people who are presenting in person. I have all of the presentations in a Google Drive, so we just have to keep our fingers crossed that we keep internet, and we will do the best that we can. So the format of this is that the presentations are 12 minutes and then 3 minutes for questions. I will be giving a 5-minute, a 3-minute, and a 1-minute warning so that people can keep track of what they're doing. So as I mentioned before, the people who are standing up here, if you want to be on camera, stand between here and here. There's a microphone there if you need it. There's a microphone there if you need it. So I'm going to start with Kim Steele, and I'm going to be running her PowerPoint because she is remote. Rattling. Yes, no? Okay. Okay, so Kim, just tell me when you want me to go forward on the slides.
Okay. Good morning. My name's Kimberly Steele. I'm a rising senior here at Randolph College. I had the privilege of working with Dr. Courier in the summer research program. We're interested in studying the generational differences in descriptions and interpretations of sexual violence experiences. We'd like to thank the summer research program and the RISE grant for making this and other research possible. Next slide, please. Before we go any further, I will issue a trigger warning. I'll be discussing sexual violence. I'll be not going into graphic detail about experiences that we studied. However, we realize this may be a difficult topic for some. Your mental health comes first. Please feel free to do what is best for you at this time. Next slide, please. Starting out, we were interested if people in different generations define, describe, and interpret experiences with sexual violence differently. Sexual violence affects more people than we are aware. According to RAINN, every 68 seconds, an American is sexually assaulted. Every 9 minutes, that victim is a child, someone under the age of 18. And yet, only 25 out of every 1,000 perpetrators will end up in prison. So in my 12-minute presentation today, 10.858 Americans will be the victim of sexual violence. Next slide, please. For a methodology, we conducted 14 in-depth interviews, 4 more than we had planned for this summer. These interviews lasted anywhere between 40 and 90 minutes. Our interviews were transcribed professionally, then using grounded theory, a qualitative form of analysis, we coded for broader themes. Of those 14 interviews, the demographics were all participants happened to be women. The ages we interviewed were 20 to 58, whose sexual violence had occurred between the ages of 4 and 33. The races of the interviewees were 1 Black woman, 2 biracial women, 11 white women. Their sexualities were 8 straight, 3 bisexual, 1 lesbian, and 1 pansexual. All of the violent actions were perpetrated by men. Next slide, please. Although we found many themes and concepts we'll be exploring in the future, I'll be addressing 5 major themes today: motivation for participating in study, definition of experience, motivation of reporting or not reporting, sexual education, long-term negative effects, and future research topics. Next slide, please. So, what were their motivations in participating? In any interview, we opened up with this question. It seemed to be an icebreaker to make the participant comfortable. This question ended up being one of the most interesting results because of the emotions it evoked in participants. Having a voice, being heard. Although not a direct reason for being in our study, 100% of participants thanked us for listening to their story and validating their experience. In one case, the participant had never shared with anyone before us. Being believed. Belief was a strong theme. The status, gender, role, and reputation of the victim or perpetrator played a huge role in whether they were believed or would be taken seriously. Wanting others to know that they're not alone. One person steps forward, others are more apt to share their story as well. wanting to make a difference for girls and women, changing how we handle situations when they occur. The Me Too movement. The Me Too movement was viewed in different ways throughout generations. To normalize, let's see, sorry. In the beginning stages of our interview process, we asked about the Me Too movement. But as we did not ask about the Me Too movement, but as we reached the halfway point, our participants mentioned it as salient, so it became one of our questions. Luis, age 58, said, I really felt excited in a way, not like, yoo-hoo, but finally, to normalize something that is nearly universal experience women have. And education of others, telling others what these issues are still ongoing and what to do when they occur. Next slide, please. When asked why she wanted to participate, 50-year-old Alaya said, I'd like to be a helper and I also love data. I'm a person who hasn't been believed. And I think it's important to have people who are willing to speak so that the truth gets out there and so that there is research to back up the volume that's probably already happening or closer to the reported happenings. Next slide, please. Using qualitative research and as social scientists, we as researchers want to give participants the ability to define their own experience in their own terms. The expansive terms used amazed us, given there were only 14 interviews. The terms the participants used for what they had experienced were sexual assault, rape, date rape, acquaintance rape, attempted rape, dating violence, peeping Tom, stalking, molestation, interpersonal violence, incest, harassment, and harassment of a child. And some didn't know what to call it. Most often, victims minimized their own experience. They felt it wasn't as bad for them as it was for others. Media and television also play a large role in how they define their own experience. Next slide, please. We found Sarah's words were thought-provoking. She explained, my experience was rape, but I also feel like I didn't get it that bad. Like if you were to compare it to a hurricane, mine's, rape, like a really bad tropical storm that could be a hurricane, but not really. Meanwhile, I know people that have had category 5 rape if you compare it to a hurricane. Next slide, please. This is a graphic we found that is a visualization of common reasons why people don't report their assaults. We heard many of these participants, and in fact, only 5 reported to any type of official. One of the most disturbing findings was that only one of those that did report had a positive outcome in her case. The rest said they got little to no support from officials. For those who did not report, there are a variety of reasons, but our interview with Tori revealed the pattern that we heard in most that did not report. They did not feel like officials would support them in either school administrations or the police. Next slide, please. Tori said, I don't feel like they're here to protect me. I don't feel like they're here to protect anyone, but people they agree with and people that look like them. Honestly, I'm not a fan of all police in general, but I'm speaking about white policemen. I don't think police are here to protect us. I think they're here to police us, if that makes sense. But I don't think they're here to protect me. Next slide, please. Sexual education. One of our most unexpected findings was that most of our participants said that they had little or no sex education from their parents or families. Most learned about sex from peers, the internet, pornography, or church programs. This meant that most reported that they felt undereducated in sex in general. So when sexual violence happened to them, they weren't always sure how to react because it had no context for what was right or wrong. Not only did we see a lack in sexual education, but a lack into what to expect or not tolerate when dating. Many thought they needed to emulate relationships that they viewed on television or movies. Next slide, please. The last thing I want to address is the long-term effects of sexual violence. Next slide, please. In our interviews, we found long-term therapy, lack of trust, not trusting men in general, sexual promiscuity, self-doubt, minimizing their experience, and ongoing triggers. This is mirrored by other research we found by RAIN. According to RAIN, the likelihood a person suffers some suicidal or depressive thoughts increases after sexual violence. 94% of women who are raped experience symptoms of PTSD during the 2 weeks following rape. 30% of women report symptoms of PTSD 9 months after the rape. 33% of women who are raped contemplate suicide. 13% of women who are raped attempt suicide. Approximately 7% of rape or sexual assault victims experience either severe distress, a large percentage for any other violent crime. Other factors are more likely to use drugs than the general public, pregnancy or STDs, and cost of physical hospital visits and therapy. Next slide, please. Here are just a few triggers that participants mentioned. Being outside, the smell of the rain, the band Sublime, Old Spice, shadows in the night, and pressure around my wrists. Next slide, please. For us, the summer research in RISE is just beginning of a continued research on sexual violence. In my senior paper, I plan to explore other topics we have found. One of our participants asked, what makes our research different than other research out there? We hope to dive into ongoing consent, a term we're using for the need for those in relationships to have the understanding that even though you're sexually active before with your partner, that means that consent is needed in every sexual interaction. Consent needs to be given throughout the sexual experience. If a partner decides at any point no, the interaction should cease. Empathy, when rapists get more sympathy than the victims themselves. And mental rape, the ongoing issues that continue after the physical experience. This could mean interactions, the gossips or stories that are told, or the underlying mental issues that occur for the victim. Next slide, please. So interdisciplinary applicability. Perhaps it's time we look into sexual education for girls and boys. Sexual education is more than just a physical act. This shows a comprehensive look at what conversations we should be having. Next slide, please. What can you do for someone? These are the things we've heard from our participants that help them the most. Listen, believe, affirm and validate, don't push, offer help of resources, and ask, what can I do? Next slide. What if it happens or happened to you? Ask for help and don't blame yourself. Here are some helpful resources, and we are available at any time. Next slide, please. And we're going to end with, from our survivor, Jennifer stated, sometimes being strong isn't enough. It's being strong after the bad things happen, being strong and being vulnerable, being able to help, being able to hold that hurt person, being able to ask others to hold that hurt person on the next day, because the bad things aren't going to stop happening. But the ways in which we respond to bad things can change. We wanted to give special thanks to those that we interviewed for our research. You are strong, you are believed, and we're sorry. I also personally wanted to thank Dr. Courier for choosing me to be trusted with important research. I've learned many things during summer research, personally and academically, and I will carry it with me for my lifetime. Thank you so much. And then any questions?
Okay, questions? Dr. Salika.
I know you've mentioned continuing this on further. What are next steps for you within this project?
What are next steps?
Okay, so we would like to, by the time I graduate, conduct about 50 interviews and do more coding, get that together. We've done literature review, but we'd like to do even more literature review. So those are my goals, and to explore the 3 topics I stated.
You mentioned kind of thinking about sex education in a different way. Do you mind just speaking a little bit more about that? It's a really interesting topic.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sorry, I put a timer on. So I believe, for my own personal self and others, just all the stories, we hadn't heard really anything about sex education in school, or where parents were doing, like, it was just so minimal. And I feel like it's so important. And I feel like it starts early as well. I feel like consent with your body starts early as a small child and then grows. I mean, there are topics that you don't talk about with certain kids, but I mean, certain ages of children. But as they grow, you can kind of grow. I think they should have body autonomy and be proud of their body parts and label them appropriately. And eventually I would love to become like a school counselor and talk about things like that. Does that answer your question?
That's fantastic.
Dr. Tatum will be the last question.
My question has to do with the ethical challenges of conducting this research.
Ethical challenges of conducting the research?
I know this can be really hard to get approved through IRB.
Yep.
And so I'm actually wondering well, I guess two questions. How did you recruit your participants and what was your protocol in terms of dealing with adverse events during this?
Did you hear her, Kimberly?
I think I did. So what was our how did we recruit participants and what I guess what did we face going through that? Well, we both put an open call on social media about it and had participants reach out to us. And then there was a snowball sample from that. They had other people that they said they interviewed with us and they got in touch with us that way. We also started the IRB process really early on before summer research to make sure that everything was covered. For the case of Dr. Courier and myself, we planned not to talk to anyone at Randolph College who is a current student, just because that could cause some problems. She may have them in classes, I may have them in classes. And the fact that you are you a mandated reporter, Dr. Courier? Or yes, you're a mandated reporter. So we needed to make sure that they felt comfortable and safe talking to us.
So that unfortunately 2 minutes. I forgot to share the slides for Kim's, so this is going to be available in the future. Dr. Warren just texted me. So everybody here could see it, but people on Zoom could not see it. So I apologize. I will start sharing for the next one. So we need to move on. We got- Here we go. Sorry guys, I ended up having to do this because you all sent it to me in different formats. So there was no one format. So I had to put it into the video file. Yeah.
If you two are trying to make it full screen, try F11.
Like apply that. Something to do with that.
So you're pushing the right too, makes the slides look like it's supposed to, push the right.
No.
Yeah.
If you want, you can just present it that way. I mean, I don't think anyone will mind.
From the drive.
Yeah.
That's what we've been trying to
Yeah,
do.
maybe try to download the PDF instead of the doc. Try it.
Okay, we're gonna stop share for now. So, and then you just,
That's the one with the two.
so this is, let's see, this is the PDF. That's what I'm saying. This is what I did.
From the doc or from the PDF itself?
So much fun. Dr. Sheldon, do you have any suggestions? He's not. He left. See, the problem is
You can exit the full screen.
I need somebody. Why is it?
There we go.
Next to the star. Got it.
There we go.
Okay. You were telling me. Which one is it?
There we go.
All the way to the left bottom.
Yeah, but I don't know if it'll,
Okay.
I want to just share the whole thing just in
Okay.
case.
So my name's Jillian,
My name's Noah.
and we did our summer research project with Dr. Penn on the permutation orbitals of the Heisenberg algebra. We're first going to start out with Alexander Grothendieck. He was an amazing mathematician. He grew up in Nazi Germany, and he fled and studied math in Paris. And the reason why we picked him is because of his purpose of research. He did amazing work in abstract mathematics and was able to figure out like you can cross multiple different categories and varieties of math into one big giant category, which related a lot to what we did. So the outline of our presentation, we're first going to start out talking with what are vertex algebras and why the Heisenberg vertex algebra is special compared to just the regular vertex algebra. And we're also going to talk about the differences between copies of V4, which is also decline subgroup. And we're first going to start out talking with regular vertex algebras and the monster group. It's basically this big discovery that all of mathematics are combined into one, and it's the largest sporadic simple group. And it's basically, to put in basic terms, like a big prime number for all groups. And then we're going to talk about the idea of a vertex algebra. A vertex algebra is a vector space V, combination of vectors forming an imaginary space, together with infinitely many multiplications, as we say, indexed by integers. So to put it in simple terms, so it's not as wordy and mathy, the negative products generalize normal multiplication, and the non-negative products generalize the commutator, the examples AB minus BA, which is also known as a Lie bracket. But for our research, AB and BA are non-commutative, so this does not equal 0. And there's a derivation that links all these products together, which is shown below. And the relation of negative products and the normally ordered product. So how we connect negative products and normally ordered products is by this equation above. And the colons are the notation for a normally ordered product, which you will see following in the presentation.
Yeah.
And that's just. All right, so we're going to start with a familiar example. In high school algebra, you may have seen this single variable polynomial. But for our Heidelberg algebra, we use this multivariable polynomial where there's different variables being multiplied. And why you may ask we did this, it's because the Heidelberg vertex algebras are very close to polynomials with additional structure. As you can see, with our alpha, we just keep taking derivatives like we would single variable polynomials.
So from here, we're going to compare the Heisenberg vertex algebra with a linear polynomial across this transformation, which takes xi to its negative and alpha to its negative. In the linear polynomial ring, as you can see, when you take both x3 and x1 of their negatives, you get -1 squared, and so that equals 1, and you get something that's the same as when you started. And in the Heisenberg, you get the same thing. When you take the third derivative of alpha and the first derivative of alpha, you get -1 squared, which gives you the same thing that you started with, and we call these fixed. However, if you take 3 copies of something from the linear polynomial ring or 3 copies from something in Heisenberg, you get something that's not fixed because you have a -1 cubed here, and so you end up with a negative of what you started with. And the reason that Heisenberg is kind of special is because in the Heisenberg, we have these relations amongst the generators alpha. Because they're not commutative, those relations AB minus BA aren't equal to 0, and so we only need 2 generators, alpha with alpha, and then the normally ordered product of the second derivative of alpha with alpha, as opposed to this linear polynomial ring where the multiplication is commutative, we need infinitely many generators. I want to take a second and talk about weight and type. So in the Heisenberg algebra, the generator alpha has a weight of 1, and each additional derivative adds another weight 1 to it. So, for example, this term is the normally ordered product of the third derivative of alpha with the fourth derivative of alpha has a weight 1 plus 1 for the 2 alphas plus 3 plus 4 for the number of derivatives. So we say that this whole term has weight 9. And generating sets have types. And so if we say the generators of this subalgebra at HC2 have generators of weight 2 and 4, then we say HC2 is of type 2, not 4. And our problem was to find subalgebras of H4 that's generated by these 4 copies of alpha, where the acting group kind of mixes up the generators. And that's kind of shown below. If you go and click to the next slide, Julian. There's two groups here acting on the Heisenberg algebra separately that I want to fix. And in the first one, there's a sort of rotation going on where the first alpha goes to the second alpha goes to the third alpha goes to the fourth alpha, and the fourth alpha goes to the first alpha in this Z4 group that's highlighted in blue. And in Z3, there's a similar sort of mix up, but it's not exactly the same, where the first alpha goes to the second alpha goes to the third goes to the first, and then the fourth stays at the fourth alpha. So there's different kind of mix-ups, and if we look at all of the such mixings of these groups, we get the group S4 in total, and it has 10 subgroups. And our goal is to describe all of these subalgebras of H4. And these are the subgroups of S4 and the subalgebras that we wanted to describe. And I think the most interesting example of these is these two copies of this Klein Group 4. And they have two different generating sets. There's two different copies of this. And the first generating set is 1, 2, which switches 1, 2, or 3, 4, versus the other sort of algebra that switches 1, 2, and 3, 4 simultaneously, or switches 1, 3, and 2, 4 simultaneously. And we kind of depict these using different symmetries with me and Jillian in a parallelogram rectangle on the next slide. So this is us pre-transformed, us and the rectangle. If you go ahead and click over. If we take the first copy where you switch 1, 2, or 3, 4, either me or Jillian are flipped, or the corners of the rectangle are flipped. So with this transformation, me and Jillian stay the same, and we would say we were fixed, whereas the rectangle is not. It ends up in an hourglass shape because you're bending one of the two corners, depending on which ones you're flipping. But if you take the other copy, it's more of a rotation, and you get half of Jillian stuck to me. So we're not fixed, but the rectangle, if you just rotate it, is still the same rectangle you started with. So that's the kind of symmetries we looked at. And then after looking at these symmetries, we kind of tricked the computer into limiting the number of generators using the relations from earlier. And then we kind of fixed terms that were out of order from before. And this is kind of an example of the relations that we worked with on the computer. This is probably the most difficult part of the presentation at this point. It was just very technical and kind of grindy, but we say trick because it wasn't exactly, it wasn't very straightforward. The computer didn't want to like do the calculations, so we kind of had to code it to do them anyway and then fix the errors by hand. And the yellow stuff is the stuff that's out of order. And when we put it in order, we ended up with a lot of extra terms that kind of added on to the rest of the equation. And after this, we could include from this M, this general M, we could include a minimal generating set by using a bunch of these relations together. So I also wanted to go back now and talk about how these two different Klein 4 groups decompose the Heisenberg algebra in the more simple version where me and Jillian switch, where you switch in either 1 or 2 or 3 or 4. That decomposes the Heisenberg algebra into two copies of the Heisenberg by itself, and then a bunch of other kind of non-simple stuff. And then, but this more complicated side of Klein 4 decomposes the Heisenberg into one copy with significantly more complicated stuff than the simple version does. And their types are listed here below. So the simple version is type 1 squared, 2 squared, 4 squared, and the more complicated version is 1, 2 cubed, 3, 4 to the 5th, 5 to the 3rd, and 6. And as you can see, those kind of the 1 squared in the more simple version and the 1 by itself in the more complicated version are the kind of pulling of the Heisenberg algebra in each section. And these following kind of similar processes, we did a bunch of other groups as well. We kind of confirmed findings from other people as well as doing an H4Z4 and H4Z4 on the summary. So thank you.
Questions?
Yes, Dr. Sloan.
So I already hesitate to ask this because I think it's really cool and important. In what ways is it important?
So the way that I asked the same question actually this summer. I was like, why am I even doing this? But I saw this YouTube video on it. It was actually really instructive. And it was like this guy, Leonard Euler, who some of you may have heard of, some of you may not have, but he did a bunch of different things with number theory. And at the time, no one used them. And everyone was like, why are you doing this? But now we use number theory all the time to make sure our packages don't get lost, to make sure your credit card numbers aren't stolen. So it's not necessarily what we can do with it now, but what we might be able to do with it in the future.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you all.
I did test.
I think I might need to open it as a PowerPoint because I open it.
So like,
I think I can just open it. Yeah.
down there.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Some sort of measure.
So I think we might be. Right, it should work now.
Yeah, it's gonna work.
Okay.
I just want to.
Yeah,
We're good.
Okay.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to my presentation on my project. I did a podcast called A Step Toward Justice, and I did this project with Dr. Justina Wakata, and we were funded by the Randolph College Center Research Program. Okay. So before I get into the bulk of my presentation, I wanted to ask you all to go subscribe to our podcast. You can do it now if you want. You can find us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify at A Step Toward Justice. You should also go follow our Instagram at A Step Toward Justice podcast. I'm going to play a clip. That's about a minute. So if you want to get your phones out now and go subscribe and do all the things, that would be great. Okay, let's see if this is going to be my friend today.
What does reproductive justice mean to you?
To me personally, it means that I should have freedom, like in any sort of situation, to make a decision without disruption from the doctor or any outside forces.
Reproductive justice, I think, is about abortion rights, rights to birth control, making sure people are educated about STDs, STIs, and just making sure everyone has the proper care to have a child or not have a child.
I think about how it affects my brother who's trans and like the things that he has to go through and the things he's dealing with, especially when it comes to like the search of like women's health and because everything's about women's health, not women's stuff, like that kind of stuff.
So should the institution at that point be bringing those conversations to the community? Absolutely, yes, because we're not having those discussions.
So that was a clip from our trailer that we premiered 2 weeks ago, I think. Nope, don't do that. Okay. It's finicky sometimes. It did that yesterday too. So here's the outline of the topics that I'm going to be covering in my talk today, and I will go into specifics as we progress. I'm going to go ahead and go to the next slide. Beautiful. Okay, so I wanted to open up the main portion of my talk talking about a story that to me was really impactful in my understanding of the necessity of reproductive justice and the histories associated with that. So I'm going to tell really briefly the story of Anarcha, Lucy, and Betsy, who were 3 of the 12 enslaved women that Dr. James Marion Sims experimented on. So for those who don't know, Dr. James Marion Sims, among other things, did a series of experiments from 1844 to 1849, trying to cure a condition called vesicovaginal fistula, which, among a host of other things, prevented women from having further children, which was a problem in the slave economy of the South. So to try and cure this condition, he did many experimental procedures, and he used multiple methods, and he did eventually succeed using silver sutures. And that's the history that we've been told, right? That's the history that most people know, but recently there's been scholarship talking about the people that he experimented on. And that's, to me, is what really is important, because talking about Sims and just talking about Sims ignores the history of the violation of these women. These women had endured immeasurable pain. These surgeries were conducted without anesthesia after it had been invented in 1846, so it was a thing. And these were also experiments. And to conduct experiments, you need to fail. And these surgeries were incredibly invasive and incredibly painful, and they failed over and over and over again. So that was just incredibly painful. Another thing that I wanted to note is that we only know the names of 3 of these women. There were at least 12, but their names are lost to history. So again, I wanted to talk about this story because it shaped my understanding of the reproductive justice framework and reframing these historical events within this context. So reproductive justice has three main principles: the right to not have a child, the right to have a child, and the right to parent a child in a safe and healthy environment. And these experiments, obviously, that doesn't exist for these women. These women had their choice, their consent, and their bodily autonomy denied to them. So I think this history is important to talk about, and I can't talk about SIMS too much because I have a very limited time. So if you want to know more about SIMS and a couple other medical racism and scientific racism things, check out our second episode, which will be premiering next Wednesday. Okay, so these are the episode topics that we're going to cover. Not going to talk about them too much because I don't have too much time to go into specifics, but episodes will air every Wednesday. Our first episode went out on July 7th, so it's live. Go listen to it. It's pretty great. Our episodes will premiere every Wednesday. So the next episode will be premiering July 14th, 21st, etc., until we reach the final episode. So I'm not going to talk about my topics. I did want to talk about why we decided to do these topics, and it was really mostly about Dr. Licata and my specific interests. I had prior knowledge of some historical oppressions and some medical racism, hence the Dr. Lucy and Betsy. I was already aware of that story prior to this program, but I wanted to dive a bit more into those topics. So my episodes were reproductive justice, what is reproductive justice, and scientific and medical racism. And my last episode is the LGBTQ and disability communities in relation to reproductive justice. And that for me was really important because I'm really passionate about advocating for these communities who so often have been denied voices, and we are seeing more recent conversation incorporating these communities, which I think is wonderful. Our episodes also focus on analyzing both the past and present, using past historical events and analyzing those and comparing them to present reproductive oppressions. So why did we decide to do a podcast? It was mostly about accessibility. So not only are we breaking up our topics into digestible 20 to 40-minute episodes, and there were a plethora of other topics we could have picked from, but we decided to do these because we were interested in them. But also having a podcast gives greater access to the public, so you're not blocked by things like a paywall or having a specific academic audience. I also wanted to make a note about transcripts. Transcripts will be available as each episode premieres. That was really important to me because I wanted to try and make this podcast series as accessible as possible. So what's the point? Why should you care? Historians look at the past, and reproductive justice really reframes the way in which bodily autonomy and choice have historically been denied to people of color and are presently being denied to people of color and forms of oppression. And a unique component of this project is that, as I said, we are analyzing both the past and the present, so we can look at how past historical oppressions are affecting the present and how past and present historical oppressions potentially affect the future. I also wanted to make a note about the inclusivity of this movement. This movement is by nature inclusive, and having these conversations within these inclusive communities is very important, I think, to incorporate communities that have not historically been included in discussions. All right, so I wanted to take a quick moment to thank those in the Randolph College Summer Research Program, including Dr. Danielle Courier, Louisa Carrera, and Erin Whalen. I also wanted to thank those that we interviewed for your oral histories. We could not have made this project without you, and I'm very grateful. I also wanted to thank Dr. Justina Licata. And on the right side of the screen are a couple of texts that were the most influential. This list is by no means exhaustive. If you want more, come to me. I have a plethora of books to give you. But I thought that these were a good place to start. If you wanted additional research, go listen to our podcast. But if you want more research, you can go look at these texts. Okay, thank you very much. Oh, okay.
Questions?
Oh, sorry.
How can we all be better advocates for these people in public and in this type of stuff?
Okay, so I am new to advocating for these communities, and I do not want to speak for them because that is not my place. I recommend talking to people and asking what would best help them in situations where they may or may not need help, and really listening to disabled people and LGBTQ communities and listening to their personal experiences and not really judging because people judge a lot. And so by being open and willing to listen, I think that's one of the most important things that you can do. Yes.
Dr. Lauren asked a question. She said, what guest speakers would you like to have and why?
That's a hard question. I think Dorothy Roberts would be a really good. The symposium this past semester, we got her to speak, yay. So that was really great. I think Loretta Ross would be a good source as well. Who else? I think Deidre Cooper Owens, who wrote Medical Bondage, who she talks about Sims in her book. I think she would be a really interesting person to interview. There are a whole bunch of people. Like I can't just pick like one.
Great. Good question. So I have a question. How ongoing do you see this as being? Is this something after this and then after next year? Do you want to keep doing this? Like, particularly if it's successful when you start getting much
I mean, I would love for it to be successful. That would be great. But I think, to me personally, at least, this project is contributing to the conversation and trying to educate people in the necessity of understanding this framework and then understanding how this framework can be applicable to multiple forms of oppression and analyzing those, and also analyzing disadvantaged communities or communities that have been historically disadvantaged.
I want to ask you a question. Do you have experience of making podcasts before? If not, or if yes, regardless, I wanted to know what your experience has been so far and what you have learned. What are some of the challenges you faced?
Okay, so yes, I have made a podcast before in Dr. Wakata's class. I think it was African Americans in the Construction of American History or something along those lines. We were tasked with making an episode for, we were reading a book, and then we were tasked with making an episode basically describing that book and how it affects the construction of American society. They were all written by African American authors, and I did a horrible job of explaining that project. But yes, I did have prior experience. Second question. Oh, difficulties. We had a new mic, so that was nice. It was very different from recording on my phone. So it went a lot smoother. We didn't really face a lot of issues, I would say, except that my computer is a Chromebook, so it doesn't really like the program that we were using to audio edit. So sometimes I would like edit and then it would be like, we're not going to work today. So, you know, that was fun. But other than that, there weren't really any major technical or otherwise challenges. Thank you.
Is there any chance I can present on my computer?
People online can't really understand, or at least I can't understand what you're saying.
Are people having a hard time hearing us?
I can now.
Oh, I can hear you now.
Okay. So are you guys going to share or am I going to share?
Yeah, I can share it.
Okay.
One second.
I guess I'll just start. So our project is the ultrasonic vocalizations of neural networks. It's funded by Randolph College's summer research program. You can continue. So just for an outline of our project, in this presentation, we are going to discuss the background and purpose of our research, our methods and results, as well as the next steps going forward, and a brief summary as our conclusion. So our work gives aid in the study of neuropsychiatric diseases associated with a communication and or social deficits by studying the interactions of mice. We do this by analyzing how the social and behavioral deficits present in particular mice affect their vocalizations. Oftentimes, mice communicate in the ultrasonic range of about 20 to 200 kilohertz, which is undetectable to the human ear. We use spectrograms to analyze their communications. However, the manual or by-eye analyses are often extremely time-consuming and come with a large variation of error percentage depending on who is doing the analysis. Because of this, we wanted to try to make a machine learning algorithm that was comparable in quality to our human process data as a way to hopefully stabilize the error percentage in vocalization detection and increase time efficiency. Slide. The specific purpose we chose for our project was to build a better neural network for detecting mouse vocalizations than the pre-existing network DeepSqueak, and as well as determine the accuracy or error percentage of both networks. For those who are unfamiliar, DeepSqueak is a well-known but not greatly reliable supervised learning program, that being a program that uses human-labeled data for training an algorithm, and that was designed for the cleaning and analysis of rodent vocalization data. Next slide.
All right, so student responsibilities. So during the summer research program, Dr. Shank and Michaela made edits to the call segmentation code, which I'll go over a little bit later, but basically that's just the GUI code that Dr. Shank already had. Next, both Michaela and I were responsible for verifying the call segmentation and detection on the original data, which I'll also go over that in a second. Sam was responsible for preparing the data for machine use and basically building the neural network in TensorFlow, and he also trained and tested this network. And then all of us basically helped in the final compilation and interpretation of this work. So methods. After Dr. Shank and Michaela made updates to the MATLAB segmentation code, which, like I said earlier, is the GUI code that Dr. Shank originally had, basically what they did was they made it easier to use, and they allowed us to be able to define whether it was a call or was not a call. Michaela and I used this code to go through various data files and add segments, edit call length boundaries, and basically mark extraneous noises as either a call or not a call. For accuracy, we analyzed previous data used by Dr. Shank and students from previous SRP research. So like last year's research, we used that data and data from other colleges, and we verified their calls and translated them to a new format. So if you look over here to the right, you'll see these different calls or different segments. And what we had to do was when analyzing this data, we had to go to main, and the left yellow line is when the call would start and the right was when it would finish. So basically we just had to go in and either shorten it or make it bigger in order to get that specific call. And then we went through and said if it was either a call or not a call. And basically what a call or not a call means, if we say not a call, that assigns it the 0, which means false. And if we say it is a call, that assigns it a 1, which means it's true. And this allows us to train our network, which is going to be spoken more in depth by Sam. Next, we have this graph. So this is basically just going over what it is that we were looking at. So if you look above on the left, the white graph is a wave envelope that has been filtered from background noise. And below it is the black spectrogram, which is frequency versus time graph that displays the frequencies that are mixing. So basically, when we were analyzing our data, we only used the spectrograms. And as you can see, the brighter the wave is, basically the louder the sound was, and the darker it is, the softer it was, which is what helped us see if it was actually a call or not. And if you can look in this graph right here, if you can, I don't know if you can really see on the screen, but at the top, there looks like a little bit of static, and that's because it is static. This is the, I guess, like the rawer form of the blue graph, and it just shows everything.
So we got our data from a lot of different places, and we ended up with almost a terabyte of it, which is too much to upload reasonably quickly to a network. So I wrote a program that would go through, our data is high definition audio files containing everything, the calls and the dead space in between them, alongside lists of the important parts of the call, of the loud things and all of the calls. I wrote a program that would go through the drive that we had it on, pick out all of the audio files and their associated lists, and take basically a picture of the spectrogram, create a spectrogram for just that part, and save these pictures into different directories depending whether they were a call or just a loud thing like a mouse squeaking on, like paws squeaking to the side. Then the segments are 0.25 seconds long, and that's generally too long for a mouse call. That was in case we had something really big. These calls are very short. Slide. And then we fed these to our neural network. A neural network is an algorithm. It's designed after the way a human brain works, where it's composed of layers, and each layer contains a whole bunch of nodes. Depending what it's for, you can have ones that are small, that are only a couple dozen, or you can have enormous ones for things like this, for image processing. Each node is connected to the nodes in the previous layer, and each connection has a weight. The weight determines how much that node cares about the value of the node it's connected to, and by changing these weights, you can train a network to do anything you really want it to. And the important part is that the network varies continuously with the values of these connections. So if you change a connection a little bit, the output only changes a little bit. There's no misspell one word and it all falls apart. And that means that you can build an algorithm program to train your network that just kind of feels its way along the thing by varying and then doing more of what does better and less of what does worse, and you'll get there eventually. So the human doesn't have to go in and train all 22 million parameters in the network. Our network had two parameters in the training process that we weren't sure what to set. Those were the batch size and the rate at which it tumbles along. And each training run, each try for those parameters took approximately 4 hours. Slide. These two parameters, are batch size and learn rate. Then to tell how well the network did with those two parameters, we look at accuracy, so what percentage of things it got right, and the loss, which is complicated, I'll get to in a minute. What we discovered was that the batch size was more beneficial when it was smaller, closer to 16 than 64 images at a time, and the learn rate that we started with was much too low. So bringing that up improved our training, and you can see there are two groups of lines. The validation data is on the bottom. So the data that it was trained on, it learned very well. The data that when we gave it new stuff to check our work, it kind of capped out at about 70%, which is kind of a problem. Next slide. So the problem is related to this loss slide. So the loss function is what we use to tell the network what it's doing wrong. It is a measure of how far we are from where we want to be, or of how uncertain the network is about what it's predicting at the moment. So if it's low, that's good. And you'll see again, there are two groups of lines on this graph. The one at the bottom that's going down, like it should be, is for the data that we're training it on. Then when we go back to check our work on the validation data, our loss goes up instead, which is indicative of a problem with the way the network is being put together, possibly overfitting, which Michaela will explain momentarily, but that is something to fix. We didn't ultimately fix that. Slide.
So as mentioned, our neural network was not as accurate as intended and became more uncertain as the training process progressed. We believe 2 reasons that may have contributed to the increasing uncertainties or high error percentages are overfitting and not only training the network with loud noises and not background or quiet noise. We have laid a lot of groundwork, and we hope that Dr. Shank's next research students will pick up from where we left off and train the algorithm with noise and quiet sounds, as well as determine where our error lies in overfitting. These errors could include small or improperly randomized data sets or networks with just enough storage to memorize the incoming data, as we want to provide more than it can memorize so that the most accurate image image recognition. Additionally, the project can be improved by changing the signal image sizes, which you can see on the right of the slides, that were used for training our network. As these images were high in contrast, they need to have specific minimum and maximum intensities to prevent a loud sound from blocking everything else out. It would be beneficial for future students to play around with these parameters and to better control how much noise is fed into the machine. Finally, we did not yet reach the goal of comparing our network's accuracy to DeepSqueak, as we were still working on testing and tuning our network. So that task shall be left for the following project. Next slide.
Okay, so as previously stated, the purpose of this research was to create basically a neural network to distinguish mouse vocalizations from background and extraneous noises. So that way we could make a program or a neural network that was better than DeepSqueak. We also had to determine the accuracy and error of percentages of both. In our research, we made a lot of beneficial changes to Dr. Shank's segmentation code to make analyzing data easier. And we also translated the already analyzed data to a format that could be easily used to train the neural network. After training the network, we determined the error percentage of this network, but we didn't get so far as to actually compare it next to DeepSqueak and actually compare those. So therefore, the purpose of this research was partially fulfilled and can be continued next year. Here are our references. Acknowledgements.
You have time for like one question?
Okay, just one question. No, you guys said 12 minutes. Can you stop?
Oh, so are we at 12 or 15? Or 12?
You have 3 minutes for questions. Questions?
Did you use a sigmoid function for the neural network?
Most of the layers in the network are Rayleigh. At least the fully connected layers at the top that we added are Rayleigh. But once underneath are the MobileNet v2 network was pre-trained, and we just use transfer learning to classify on top of it. So no.
Are you thinking of using a different framework maybe in the future?
It would be worth trying a couple of different ones, yeah, to see if perhaps the MobileNet version is slightly too large for the overfitting problem, maybe.
Yeah, keep trying this route pretty much, although that is a giant problem. So Dr. Warren asked in the chat, are the background noise conditions consistent throughout the data set used to build the neural network? Were all data collected in the same location / setup?
That's a question I would. Yeah, and she answered that.
Yep. Okay. Cool.
Yes.
I have a question. I think I'm always curious. I know the visual analysis is sort of the gold standard. How is it really determined what is a call and what isn't? To start that, does that make sense? Like it feels like a hard thing to make the initial, this is real and this isn't.
It absolutely is. Michaela was the one who did most of that work. So
what we did specifically was pretty much reference Dr. Shank's and her collaborators' work from previous years with what they deemed was called and what was not called. It needs a lot of training, like Dr. Shank kind of put in the chat. It is very difficult. So luckily we had those references that we could translate what they did into the new format and use it for the algorithm, and it's been like checked by multiple people. But I guess I could say when I was going through it, I noticed that calls were a lot smaller than noise, like not background noise that would be static, but if you remember the going forward slide, I had two pictures and one had a lot of white on it. And then there was one that just had basically a thin line downward. And that was a good way for me to understand what were calls and weren't, as they were very small segments. Yeah.
Cool. All right, thank you guys. So Ariadne, are you going to do your own? Yep, apparently.
I have been talking and I just realized I was muted. So, good morning, everybody. Welcome to my presentation. My name is Ariadne. I worked with Professor Seyfuddin, and our topic of research was brand affiliation's impact on hotel performance. And I thank you to Randolph College for funding the summer research program. So our outline in this presentation, we will be discussing the purpose, how we collected the data, and what methods we used to analyze it, what our results were, the impact of COVID-19 with these results, what limitations we faced as well. So the purpose of our research was to identify the relationship between brand affiliation and hotel performance. So brand affiliation is the difference between having your independent mom and pop hotel that may rebrand to a better name or a bigger name like Comfort Inn. So in exchange for being able to use the brand name, the hotels are, they may be more likely to experience better outcomes financially. And previous research shows that this is true, that there is a positive relationship between brand affiliation and hotel performance. So specifically in this research, we wanted to extend on that by asking what factors have an impact on this relationship. So our hypothesis being, what financial returns do hotels experience after rebranding? So as far as data collection goes, we took two data sets, one from the STR or Smith Travel Research Incorporation, which highlights different details about hotels, along with the reported tax revenue for the state of Texas. We use the state of Texas because it is the only state that requires hotels to report tax revenue. So using Python, we were able to merge these two data sets together. We focused on the tax periods between January 2010 and March 2021. Under these categories of price and location, we divided the data set. We excluded hotels that had not been rebranded in this period, and we only included the hotels that had reported revenue monthly rather than quarterly. So in our research, we used a fixed model effect with panel data, which affects for or accounts for time and entity differences. Revenue here is measured as RevPAR, or the revenue per available room. And this long equation here means essentially that the natural log of the dependent variable, being revenue, is based on the beta coefficient brand, denoted as a dummy variable in our research, with the fixed effects and then the error term. So in our hypothesis testing, we supposed that our null hypothesis would be that there is no relation, that beta equals 0. Thanks. As far as summary, our sample shows that overall, we had 267 hotels. 202 of those were branded and 65 of them were independent. Each of these hotels had around 130 months of tax revenue data. So our sample included with the multiple months per hotel was much bigger than this. We can see that more hotels are branded than independent, and we see that branded hotels experience larger profits and less variation. And these monetary values represent the monthly revenue per available room. Our results showed that at the 95% confidence interval, only 2021 and December, in the month of December, which the months are not included to make these graphs readable, we saw that those two variables were not statistically significant. We see that there is a large negative variation for 2020, which we can considerably attribute to COVID-19. And 2021 being statistically insignificant is likely due to the fact that we only have 3 months of data. Overall, though, the main finding is that we saw a 7% increase in RevPAR for hotels after rebranding. After splitting these hotels into different categories, this one being price, we found that rebranding for each of these subsections were statistically insignificant. This is never something that you want to see in your research, so I will be going into this a little bit later. We see that, however, COVID-19 negatively affected all of the price categories and statistically significantly as well. We see that the luxury hotels saw the most negative effects from COVID-19, experiencing a 79% drop in revenue. And as far as reading this table, the asterisks refer to the confidence interval. As far as location goes, which I believe is self-explanatory with the urban through small retro / town. Again, mostly the rebranding coefficients were statistically insignificant again. And some of these even had negative coefficients for the ones that are significant. So we see that resort hotels benefit the most from rebranding, but urban hotels were most hit by COVID-19 with a decrease of nearly 50%. As far as the impact of COVID-19, we see that COVID may have disrupted the status quo bias, which is a behavioral economic term for saying that consumers are typically loyal to a brand that they have experienced fondly before. So COVID-19 may mean that consumers are now loyal to different brands, or they do not show as much loyalty between specific brands. We see that COVID on this graph, the RevPAR dropped nearly 40% due to COVID. And we can attribute that maybe less business travelers means less revenue for high-end hotels. That is at least a hypothesis. But for COVID, again, all coefficients were statistically significant. The limitations in our research seem pretty self-explanatory. Most of the rebranding coefficients were statistically insignificant. And it may be worthwhile in the future to look at different methods of statistical analysis. We would also maybe use more data from more months. That would also help with the COVID anomaly. We would also look into the reason for the coefficients being statistically insignificant, whether that is the lack of a huge sample or not. We would also look into the rebranding effect on brand parents. So doing similar regressions for all hotels underneath the Marriott or the Hyatt brand, for instance. Potentially expand our sample beyond Texas would also be a worthwhile project. So then we get a better sense of how rebranding affects hotels on a national level. In conclusion, we find that rebranding increased RevPAR for hotels by nearly 7%. For branded hotels with a mean of just over $1,000, this means $80 monthly of an increase. So if you are that mom and pop hotel and you're considering whether the cost of rebranding is beneficial, then you can use that statistic. Hotels divided by price and location types were statistically insignificant. COVID-19 does account for a decrease in hotel revenue, and significantly so. And we hope to conduct future research to improve the strength of these findings. So, thank you. I will be taking questions now. Dr. Shank.
Yeah, hi. So maybe I missed it, but when they're rebranding, are they going to, in general, like, are they going to a different brand of their own making, or are they rebranding to, joining some other brand? Like, what were the sort of qualitative aspects of the rebrandings?
If I am understanding your question correctly, mostly you can have hotels that rebrand within different brands. And I believe that is the most common scenario, but then you could have a hotel that's independent going to branded or branded to independent. But there is a good bit of movement between brands. Does that answer your question?
Well, so you're saying, do you know, like, okay, did one go from Marriott to Hyatt? Or was it like going from their own little brand to a whole different, you know what I mean? I'm trying to see, like, did you account for like how popular the brand they changed to was when they changed to the brand? Do you know what I'm saying? Like, it might be beneficial to go to Hyatt, but not beneficial to go to Best Western. Sorry, Best Western, but right?
Yeah. And I believe that would be better explained by what I had mentioned in future research to look at specific brand parents and how moving between those affects hotel revenue.
And to add to that, your answer, Ariadne. So the way the rebranding was labeled is if a hotel went from an independent hotel brand to a chain affiliated brand, then we call that a rebranding. Or if it goes vice versa, the other way around, from a chain affiliated brand to an independent brand. But within the brands as well, there are classes of brands. There are some value-oriented brands. There are some high-end brands. We haven't explored that yet with regards to whether it's more beneficial to go from a low-end brand to a higher-end brand or not. We haven't explored that yet.
Thank you.
Dr. Soika?
Do you think the ready availability of reviews online impacts the effect of brand? Because I guess I do not know those restaurants for myself. When traveling, because I didn't know, I used to be more cautious about trying random restaurants because you didn't know, but now you look on your phone and it's like, everybody loves this restaurant. I've never heard of it, but I'll go. And I wonder if that becomes a benefit for, or changes how much brand matters, because you're not relying on the national reputation in the same way you can get a reputation in the hotels.
Right. So your question was, how do online reviews affect brand?
Or do you think that limits the effect of branding, or how much impact it has now because of that availability?
Yeah, I mean, I believe so. We don't have that measured, but I do believe that there is likely, I mean, different brands have different recognition. I mean, I can mention Best Western or Red Roof Inn, and that would be completely different from the Hyatt or Marriott. So I think maybe going forward, having some way to classify the rankings of, I guess, brand recognition and how people view those, along with how moving between those categories affects hotel performance, that may be a future thing to do.
And that's a very interesting question. Actually, we wanted to incorporate online reviews as part of the regression, but unfortunately, it turns out that the source that we wanted to use, which was TripAdvisor, and we wanted to call it review data from TripAdvisor, monthly ratings for hotels. But it turns out that after a hotel changes its brand, the earlier reviews are not displayed on TripAdvisor or any other website. So we couldn't then take into account the before and after review changes when the rebranding happens. We are looking into other avenues to take into account how that could dilute, or maybe most probably that will dilute the impact of rebranding. Other research does illustrate that when their online presence, that usually democratize the brands, and more independent brands are able to flourish, even though they don't have the well-known popular brands.
Yeah. I mean, my own thought is purely anecdotal. I know I'm far more likely to try the independent places when I can look at reviews than.
Right.
And the fact that you can, on the various websites, you can sort them by price or by rating or by brand. That would be an interesting. Okay, so thank you guys. You guys can just take it.
All right, this is our presentation on characterizing benthic microalgae found on the eastern shore of Virginia. I am Allison Robertson. I'm Abby Whitlow. And our faculty mentor was Dr. Sarah Soya. So think back to a time that you were near the water. Did you find that the rocks near that water were slippery? You may have even fallen. Heads in the crowd. So chances are you slipped onto dive. So what's going to be discussed in this PowerPoint presentation? First, we will discuss what are diatoms and why are they useful. We will move on to methods, both onshore and in the lab. We will then discuss the results that we obtained from the two studies came to and the studies for this. So what are these studies? We studied benthic microalgae, which is simple definition of what that is microscopic organisms that live in the shallow sediment of aquatic ecosystems. So benthic microalgae is a conglomerate of all kinds of different organisms with varying different functional roles. So, and benthic microalgae also include bacteria, diatoms, and flagellates, and green algae. So when we got our samples out in May, we noticed that the eastern shore was dominated by diatoms. So we are going to spend most of our time speaking of diatoms, even though yes, we did see a few green algae, but we saw little to no sign of bacteria and no microalgae. Why is benthic microalgae important? Benthic microalgae has medicinal properties. It also produces a lot of the oxygen that we live and breathe on. It's also phototoxic, so that means it absorbs carbon and releases oxygen. And then it's also a food source for marine life. So as I mentioned, benthic microalgae is critical to marine ecosystems that it lives in. Yet it's exceptionally understudied. So we were hoping to characterize some of the benthic microalgae found on the eastern shore of Virginia, as well as get a more clear understanding of how this forest seagrass affects the benthic microalgae. So when we went out to the eastern shore in late May, late spring, we had two tasks at hand. We wanted two different types of samples. The first being we wanted 10 samples of the top layer of sediment and water mixed together. So basically what we did, we took an average looking syringe and we went out into the water and we drug it right where the sediment and the water met. So Like I said, we got 10 of those, and then we put them all into their own individual centrifuge tubes and place them in a large dish like that. Our second type of sample, we wanted 5 sediment core samples. So we took a smaller, more skinny syringe with the top cut off, and we stuck it down into the sediment, and we put it back, and we got about 10 cc of sediment. This would be later tested for chlorophyll in the sediment. But we place it all into their own that Ziploc bag, and we would write on that Ziploc bag the sample site that we were at, as well as if the site had seagrass or didn't. Some of our sites had no seagrass, so it was bare. Some of our sites had dense seagrass, and some of our sites had sparse seagrass. So when we first went out there, we had originally planned for 12 sites. However, due to rains and weather, out there, we got to 9 sites. Plenty of samples. It really is.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but we can't hear anything on the Zoom. None of us can hear.
No,
Can you hear them?
I can hear you, Dr. Courier, but we can't hear them.
Okay, so if we speak right here, can you hear me?
Yes, you're clear there.
Okay, you're gonna have to stand right there.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Maybe if you hold the microphone.
Yeah.
If the microphone's working, you test if that particular microphone's working.
Hit it and see. Yes, okay, yeah.
Welcome to
Hold
them.
on. That's what I'm saying. Speak into it and see if they can hear you.
Okay, can you hear me in the microphone?
Yes, we can.
Beautiful.
So we had our 5 samples that were preserved. We put a preservative in them so that we can look at them later in the future, because it takes a long time to get through all of these samples. And then we had our 5 that were unpreserved. As we were looking at in these pictures, we would label the tube by site number, and we had labeled them by letters so we wouldn't get mixed up. And to look at the diatoms under the microscope, we would invert them 8 times, the centrifuge tubes, and we would let them sit for about 10 minutes. And this resends the diatoms into the water, and during the 10 minutes we're waiting, we will let the sediment that's heavier than the diatoms sink back down to the bottom. So that way we would put 3 drops of water inside and look at it under the microscope. Oh, okay. So we had 3 very common types of diatoms that we found: Nucleus, Lindorfaga, and Tabularia constrata. Nucleus is easily the most common that we found. And these are illustrations based on the type of diatoms that we found. There is the top 3 that we found versus all other diatoms that we found in each sample on the 4 sites we were able to get to. We saw 5 sets left because there's so many diatoms at each slide. It takes about a day and a half to get through a slide. Multiple slides per the site. And as you can see, the bare sites that are on the left have more of the different types of diatoms, and the other category yellow. But the denser seagrass areas have so many nuclei in site 10. So we can definitely see that there is a possible connection between seagrass and nuclei. And also there are large group of diatoms, and those are so Lindorfaga have a really characteristic shape and have a really size with a bigger nose. Some of them have a little nose in them, but a lot of them didn't. A lot of them are see-through and kind of small. So they are a little blurry in the pictures, but that's because they're so small. We're zooming a lot with these pictures.
Open up here. You have to just speak up.
Okay.
Project.
Okay. Okay, and this one was my favorite one, like it was cool. This is actually the water is actually a dam. That was a marine organism that this is cool. Water is super concentrated.
Which, yeah, so I think we use, I think we need to figure out where to
Okay,
figure it out.
yeah, okay.
Can you hear me now? We're trying to figure out where the microphone is. Can you just tell us, am I loud? You're not answering.
Yes.
I am loud. So
Yes, you are loud.
I think that the microphone is actually in the camera. We're not 100% sure. I think, yeah, I don't know.
Okay. 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 Okay, so for our conclusions, we had a lot of diatoms in our samples, and as she said, like very little cyanobacteria and green algae. And this could be due to the season that we went to take our samples. We took them in the spring, while some of the cyanobacteria and types of diatoms are temperature dependent. So if it's hotter, like in the summer and fall, they will there could be a lot more cyanobacteria. And that's also might be a reason why we found so many Navicula, because those are especially present in spring and fall. It's kind of cooler temperatures. Navicula is everywhere. There were so many that it's like half the things we found were Navicula. But I think it's pretty cool because they found a lot of them where it was very dense seagrass. So I feel like there could be a connection there that we can research further. And the types of diatom didn't change depending on if we had seagrass or not. So the different types would stay the same, but the amount of like each type would change, which is why there's so many Navicula present in the seagrass. Okay, so we have a lot of stuff to study topic. So we're hoping that as time goes on, we get better at identifying these diagrams. Very different. So, we're hoping to get onto these sediment. We are understand how the seagrass restoration efforts that are oh yeah, so we saved a baby turtle, guys.
It's gonna be a little close, but.
There we go. They also hear clicking, so then maybe.
Is that?
Is that better?
Some kind of clicking noise?
The clicking, there's a big clicking noise and then the sound goes out.
Oh, well, that's not something that we have experienced.
Can you hear us now?
A clicking is extremely loud.
It's not something that we're experiencing, so it's kind of hard for us to troubleshoot.
My mic is on, so you can hear what I'm hearing. I'm not hearing any clicking now. But we can't hear you.
How's that? Is that better?
Okay, I can hear you, and then the clicking starts again. Is it the camera or something?
do anything about it. We're calling IT right now. Yes.
No.
Dr. Courier, would it help IT if I sent you a video of what it sounds like when we hear it?
So we are basically getting it right up at the top. We did just stick the syringe in and get just a little bit of sediment for it, but we were going to test it for chlorophyll levels to see, because all of the different benthic microalgae have different chlorophyll levels that they are more prominent in. So like for this time, it was diatoms were the most dominant, and it would have had a different chlorophyll level than it would have if it was all cyanobacteria. No, yeah, it's tiny. Yeah. Yeah, it was about 10 cc's of sediment.
You guys hear that sound? I think what they're hearing, I think it's like this, it sounds like it's on the crickets in the background. I think it's actually the air system. Can you guys hear the crickets? Exactly. Okay, other questions? Okay.
So you guys mind if this is like right up here in your face?
Oh. I can project. I don't know about things, but I can project.
Sorry, if I run out.
Remote, just, we're doing the best that we can, but we need to continue with the presentation. So as Dr. Shreko said, let's focus on what they're doing and try and overlook the sound stuff, because we need to focus on all of their research and everything they do. I'm trying to get it. There we go.
All right, good morning, everyone. I'm Annalise Presley.
And I'm Daisy, and we did research with Dr. Fad in the chemistry department on the antioxidant properties of cocoa and dairy products. And then our research is also funded by Granite College Summer Research Program. So although we did different projects, we're presenting this part together, and it's mostly just to talk about why antioxidants are important, like what methodology we did and what testing we did, just because we did the same test, we just received different results. So after our presentations and during lunch, you'll see our posters with our specific results on it. But yeah, for now, we're just gonna go through the methodology and we'll share a little bit, just a little sneak peek. So again, our purpose is to investigate the antioxidant properties of various samples. So for me, I was checking a lot of different types of cocoa. So I was checking because there are some that are processed differently, which are like naturally processed cocoa and then Dutch processed cocoa, which removes some out, like it gets alkalized to make it more bitter, and to remove some acidity from it, which removes some antioxidants in it. And then I also did cocoa nibs, cocoa liqueur research, and cocoa butter, just because it's a different steps of the process in getting the cocoa beans to the cocoa powder. So those should have different amounts of antioxidants. Because again, as you're processing cocoa from the bean to like what you're ingesting, it's gonna keep losing antioxidants. And then Annalise did various nutrient-rich berries, and then she compared powdered berry samples and then whole berry samples. And then has a
So you might be wondering why we're even doing this. And obviously antioxidants are really important because we're exposed to free radicals and reactive oxygen and nitrogen species daily. Some of these can come from just our aerobic metabolism. So we expose ourselves to them. We consume these. And it's important we consume these because when lipids in our body or tissues are oxidized, it can expose us to really bad diseases like cancer, diabetes, macular degeneration, etc. The list goes on. So what we want to do is we want to try and mitigate that issue by consuming antioxidants. And we can do that by foods like cocos and berries. So most berries and also cocoa are rich in antioxidants called polyphenols, and then a subclass of polyphenols called anthocyanins.
Okay, awesome. So our main methodology we have is first we have to prepare the sample and extract the organics from it. And then afterwards we have to do columns. So I did both Amber Light and Dow's column, and then Annalise just did Dow's, which we'll go more into in a second. And then after that, we test for full antioxidant potential, then for the amount of polyphenols in each fraction, and then for the amount of flavonoids in each fraction with the assays, which again, we'll go more into in a second. So to prepare our samples, since again, we had different some whole berries, which were extracted using a reflux, which is the little setup right there on the left. So again, it's just an extraction method to get the organic compounds out. And then powdered samples that I mostly did and Annalise also did were extracted with a solution of 70-28-2 acetone water acetic acid. So for that, we have to create that solution, and then we have to weigh out 1 gram of sample, and then we have to add the solution, about 10 milliliters of solution, to the test tube with the 1 gram of sample. Then from there, we use this sonicator, which is like a little box that kind of vibrates, so it gets it all mixed up together, and we have to let it sit for a while, with about 50 minutes in room temperature, and then afterwards we have to centrifuge that so it gets separated from the so sorry. And then because that's the part one, which is the liquid, which is again, you see the image on the right. And then from there, we will take that sample and then we let it evaporate overnight. And then from there, it'll just be a little of like dryness, and then from there we add like organic matter that was separated from, and then we use that in our testing. And the cocoa butter, and then a sample Annalise had, we couldn't reflux and they didn't come in powder form, so then we had to pre-process it ourselves and make it powder. So that's another, and then afterwards we went through the whole powder sample method. So then that gives us our first fraction that we use in our analysis, and then the second fraction that I used was the amber light. So this is a resin that we put in a column that removes, it works with polarity. So first we have to lay 2 milliliters in 10 grams of the amber light, and then from there we let it sit in the fridge at least an hour, and then we rinse it through with water to get all the sugars out of the sample. And then from there we have to remove the resin, or we have to remove the sample from the resin. Resin that separates the polyphenol from the flavonoids. So this one uses ion exchange to separate the two compounds. So first we have to rinse it through with methanol, and afterwards we rinse it through with aqueous methanol. And then when we get the first rinse through, it's about 50 to 80 milliliters of methanol, and it'll give a pinkish red color. Or the first one, sorry, is a yellow brown color, and then the second run through with the aqueous methanol gives us the pinkish red color. And then the yellow brown color are polyphenols, and then the red pink color, which we have up there, are the flavonoids.
So although we don't have cute diatoms for you to look at, we do have pretty colors. So all of our assays have to do with color progression. And so what happens in this assay, in particular, assay meaning like just a fancy word for test, it's called the FRAP. assay. And what it does is that there is a specific compound or chemical in the FRAP reagent when we make it. It's called TPTZ, and this complexes with iron sulfate. And so when it complexes, it transfers an electron, and this electron transfer, depending on the concentration of iron sulfate that you have, the color progression will get darker. So the more concentrated sample you have, the darker your FRAP will be. So as you can see, we did that, and we had to establish a standard curve. And the reason we had to establish a standard curve is because grams berry, grams cocoa doesn't really correlate to anything that we can really use. So we need to use a standard to compare it to. And so we did 7 tubes with varying concentrations, and we established a standard curve. And that standard curve measured absorbance versus the concentration of iron sulfate we had in the tube. And from there, we can kind of draw like a little dotted line across and the dotted line down. And so our absorbances from our samples of berry and cocoa will give us an absorbance that correlates to iron sulfate concentration. And then we can interpret from there. Folin is just another test that we had to do for our antioxidants. And so this one in particular oxidizes with polyphenols and phenols, which is just the bigger group of antioxidants we're looking at. And then vanillin, it's a pink color, it's really pretty. This one oxidizes with the anthocyanins that we have. And this one's kind of a very nitpicky test because it reacts with a lot of different things. So we had a little bit of trouble with this one. So we got kind of funny results with this, but in general, it's supposed to complex with our anthocyanins.
Okay, and then we'd like to acknowledge Dr. Fab, Aaron from SQ Lab, our research advisor, and then again, we are funded by the Summer Research Program. So thank you all. There you go. Any questions?
So we'll have different answers because we had different samples, but so when Dr. Fab and I were looking at my results, it was kind of hard to come to a very decisive conclusion because since my samples, so I had 3 different kind of samples of blueberries. I had powdered, dried, and fresh blueberries. And when we say that these have antioxidants in them, it's hard to pinpoint and say fresh blueberries are better for you because a lot of that is water weight. So then we say, oh, add powdered blueberries to your smoothie because it will be more concentrated, but then they have to preserve it some way, and that preservation takes some of the antioxidants out of it. Or you dry it and you still have the mushy, gummy outside of it, and that's a lot of plant matter still, but it's a little more concentrated than fresh, a little less concentrated than powdered. So it's really hard to pinpoint and say that the food industry is saying that these are how many antioxidants are in your food when it varies how you process a sample.
Yeah. Well, see, I was thinking like, I feel like people don't really like scream like, oh, antioxidants when they see cocoa because it's just like chocolate. You're like, oh, this is good. But yeah, so I would say it really depends also. I would definitely say like, especially from my results, you can tell that like the natural, like whenever you gut process, like I was saying earlier, since you're making it more basic, because you're making a lot less acidic, you are taking away like the flavonoids, which are the antioxidants. So I don't really think that's like really, I guess, like broadcast a lot, but it is something that I noticed like with my data. So I feel like if it were, then it wouldn't be like false. I just think it's not really just talked a lot about with like chocolate, but I think if people were to like look into it, I think it's pretty like clear that like, you know, if like you're not like further processing it, it'll have more antioxidants.
So the claim that some of them are making that the higher the cocoa content or the dark chocolate is, the higher the nutritional value, the results seem to agree with that kind of direction.
I'm honestly not 100% sure, just because I was looking more like at the cocoa powder than like rather than like actual like chocolate. So I was mostly looking better actually pro oxidant, so they kind of like, there's also the antioxidants, they kind of like push, they're not that great for you. So, yeah, so I guess actually the claim that like, you know, dark chocolate with less fat is better for you is pretty accurate, just because again, it has less fat in it, so theoretically it should have an antioxidant. I guess it really depends on the topic.
What? Yes. Oh, yes. Oh, I'm trying to anybody that suck.
Okay, there you go, dear.
Okay. All right. Hi, everybody. I'm Michelle Starks, and I have the pleasure of working with Dr. Warren to use heat mapping to identify priorities for community strategies to address climate vulnerabilities. Here's just a small overview of what my focus on this presentation is. I have quite a bit of background information, and then I'll tell you what I'm doing in this, what I've been doing for the past 8 weeks, and what I'll be doing in the future. Oh, okay, so I want to start off with the climate resilient community. And I want you to understand that climate resilience includes a community to be able to prepare, respond, and recover. Think of what happened literally a few months ago in Texas. What happened there was not true climate resilience. Because the lines weren't truly weatherized, because the government and their power companies, oops, I don't want, because they weren't truly prepared for that cold snap, most people lost power for days and weeks, and people have lost their lives. And I kind of want you to focus on there. Okay. Okay. I want you to focus on this diagram over here, because what I'm talking about, this interaction is crucial to climate resilience. It's crucial to community resilience. But I don't just want to focus on areas like Texas. My focus is really in what's happening here. And so a few years ago, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration came out with the climate assessment, and one of our highest priorities in climate risk was increased temperature. And I know everybody hears, oh, well, global temperature is rising. I don't really feel it, and I don't really understand it, but it does affect us, because while our rural counterparts aren't feeling as much heat, in more areas like here and like downtown are feeling a true spike in that heat. And so that's what we want to focus on, is where that heat is. And it really helps us when we're mapping heat to develop strategies that are equitable to the community and that are easily available. It also helps us link where our vulnerabilities may lie in the community. So maybe people of color or people in poorer socioeconomic areas are going to probably be more likely affected. And in this map that I have on the left is a really popular map created by Jeffrey Hoffman, where he and his colleagues basically heat mapped the city of Richmond, and they also were able to link previous laws and where people who are more in desperate areas and how they're affected. They were able to link where areas that were previously redlined are more vulnerable to heat. And while it's not just Richmond that are also
vulnerable to these effects. Lynchburg has also been sort of a suspect to these. Many other cities have been redlined. And so a brief explanation of redlining is that it was practiced basically to identify high risk communities and areas. And more often than not, it was just used by home-owned loan companies and banks and other corporations just to deny Black people and people of color their way to basically move up and out of areas. And while this was outlawed in 1968, we still feel the effects of this basically 50 years later. And even now, you can basically see, you can literally walk out of Randolph and see in some areas where it's not as much tree coverage, or you can see more dilapidated buildings, and more often than not, the people are affected as well. Well, you'll see medical records wise, they're more susceptible to heat risk, like and air pollution. And so kind of looking at this map, it's sort of tilted differently than what we expect Lynchburg to look like. But so up here is really where Randolph lies. And basically how I said it earlier, we're a more decent area. We're not as like the best area, but we're not well off. But when you go down to Vermont, you can see, and I've seen it before, walking down, basically you see people in sort of a more impoverished area. But thankfully we won't be doing this whole project alone. So it's not just Randolph in this initiative. We're also working with the University of Lynchburg and Sweetbriar College and other schools within the foundation for independent colleges. So it's multiple colleges and a bunch of areas in Virginia. Basically, we're going to collect data all at the same day at the same times. And recently we were able to find out that our day of data collecting is going to be next week, July 15th. So you're going to see these lovely little devices on some people's cars driving around Lynchburg. And essentially what these devices do is that they'll be mounted on these cars, and they'll measure surface temperature of the routes that they're given, their geographic location and time, and humidity. And so when all this is done and collected, we'll give it to CAPA, and they'll basically take that data and make a nice little map for us and also give us the raw data. And so I also want to talk to you about how we designed our routes basically. And so here's just a regular map of Lynchburg, but here we focus a lot on school areas, census data, population by race, flood lines, things like that. So areas where you're going to see a lot of people, where it's concentrated in some more populous areas. And you can see basically where it's downtown, it's a lot more points because we have a lot of people down there. People often frequently visit there. There's also churches, there's places of business. So we want to see how and where they're being affected. And so we were able to get these 5 little routes. And so on that day of data collection, our volunteers will be able to drive these routes and basically give us back that data. And so what we expect this to look like, I use a nice little urban heat island map of DC because it's a very urban area, but it also has a decent amount of tree coverage like Lynchburg. And so as you can see in this very gray spot, a lot of heat is held. But you can also see on the riverbank, more heat is being released, more heat is not being held as often. And we believe that Lynchburg will also reflect this kind of temperature outcome. So, but data collection and analysis won't be the only thing we'll be able to do. In the future, we plan on creating geographic information system story map about Lynchburg and its vulnerabilities within the community. This data will be publicly available by September 2021. Also, in our climatology class taught by Dr. Warren, we'll be using this data to basically develop strategies to address these vulnerabilities within Lynchburg. And one really good example of this that a former graduate really thought of, Mitch, if you know, okay, was the tree canopy score. Basically, which I found this really nice picture. We want to develop this score and provide a more in-depth and accurate score so that we can provide this to the city council. So here's my acknowledgements. A lot of this would not be possible without outside funding and my resources. Thank you.
Can you explain the tree canopy score?
Yes, I can. Okay, so the tree canopy score is really interesting because it essentially takes data from your census, data from people's socioeconomic perspective, race, where the tree coverage from that area, and they'll take it like a nice fancy little equation and kind of put that all together. And so what they also do is they give you a base score. So an urban area like Lynchburg is going to want to have a score of around, on average, of 48 to 50%. And I actually looked at the score, and from the area that's like been measured, it's not doing too bad. On average, people are around 70% tree canopy coverage. And so it's really interesting just seeing like where that math kind of goes.
First question. What are the effects of heat on human health?
So this is actually my focus when I was doing the symposium. So a lot of, one thing is that like increase in asthma, something like that is affected by heat. Even I think if I remember correctly, even things like ADHD, heat-related illnesses, obviously, heat strokes, a lot of those are going to become more frequent in areas that are in concentrated heat areas. Oh, yes.
So that talking to city council, it'd be really interesting if you just look at Vermont Avenue, particularly further the closer you get to downtown. So from Exxon Station down to Fifth Street, it's very wide. All of Vermont's wide because there's a trolley there. There's been some talk over the years of putting a median strip there to make it easier for people to cross the street places. We have to put trees in the middle of the road. That median strip. It's not that basic an idea.
Yeah.
Because it's awfully hot down there. And again, there are fewer trees down there. It's also socioeconomically not as well off as other parts of Vermont. So I'm really curious to see how all this plays out, and then how you turn that your research into some sort of full action. Really excited about that.
Yeah. So kind of going with that, like that's really like doing that. It reduces that blacktop area, and so you're also getting that shade coverage. So you're not going to be that area is not going to be absorbing as much heat as it did before, and so therefore that heat effect is reduced because of that. So yeah, it's great to hear. Yeah.
Great.
Thank you.
Okay, we are now going to take a break for lunch. I'm going to stop recording.